Well, I have to tell you about my neighbor's horses. They have a big problem. So we have a pasture that is part of our area, and our neighbor keeps 2 horses there. And we've got some apple trees. And so as the apples fall on the ground, we'll pick them up and feed the horses these apples. And they love these apples. Well, it's getting to be that time where the tree really needed to be harvested. And so last night or later in the day yesterday, we were getting all the apples off of this one tree, just beautiful apples. But of course, there was plenty of them that had, bugs in them and things. And so we collected this big bucket of these apples. And Anna took them over to the fence and dumped them over. And the 2 horses came running, of course. And as they got there, they see this big old pile. And of course, one horse is a little more in charge than the other one. And so what does he do? Well, he's got to protect his hoard of apples. And so he starts making a fuss and keeping the other horse away. Now, what's interesting is normally when, we just bring over a few, you can give some to each one, and there they are. But now that we've got this huge pile of apples, of course, there's not enough to share. And so the one horse is hoarding them, keeping them to himself. And Anna said, they are just like dogs. And then I said, no, they're just like people. Friends, we're in our 3rd week in this series on generosity or generous living, and isn't it interesting? I mean, it's a funny story because I think it brings to life this natural tendency that not only do animals have, but we as people have, and that is, for some reason, it's almost like the more we get, the more we need to protect it, right? And so, the joke I made at the service about it was that there was more than enough apples in that pile to make that horse sick. There was more than enough to make him sick, but he was going to protect those and keep them to himself. And we tend to be the same way. It's the nature of who we are. If we've got stuff, we need to protect it. And sometimes the more we have, the more we need to protect it. And isn't it interesting, the nicer the stuff we get, the more time and energy we have to put into keeping it nice and protecting it? I always think it's interesting that when we own things like cabins or boats or whatever it is, like, they begin to own us because they need our time and attention to keep up and all that, right? You get what I'm talking about. But I felt like these horses really illustrated a lot of what Jesus is getting at as we talk about this idea of generous living. And so we're going to take one more crack at it here this week as we get chapter 12. And as he always does, Jesus gives an interesting parable to get us thinking. And then he's going to talk some more about the bigger picture of what he's really calling us to and how he's really calling us to think. And so as we talk about this idea today of generous living, I want you to be open to a couple of things. First of all, look at your own self. Okay, what is the stuff I have? What are all the gifts that I have? And how do I think about those things? Do I think about them from my own perspective, or do I think about them from God's perspective? All right? And as we go in deeper, we're going to really be asking that question. So what's God's perspective on all of this? So here's the beginning of the story in Luke 12. Someone out of the crowd said, "Teacher, order my brother to give me a fair share of the family inheritance." Anybody ever heard that issue before? Jesus replied, "Mister, what makes you think it's any of my business to be a judge or mediator for you?" Speaking to the people, he went on, "Take care. Protect yourself against the least bit of greed. Life is not defined by what you have, even when you have a lot." Then he told them this story. The farm of a certain rich man produced a terrific crop. He talked to himself, "What can I do? My barn isn't big enough for this harvest." That's a big problem, right? Then he said, "Here's what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll gather in all my grain and goods, and I'll say to myself, 'Self, you've done well. You've got it made and can now retire. Take it easy and have the time of your life.' Well, just then God showed up and said, 'Fool, tonight you die. And your barn full of goods, who gets it?' That's what happens when you fill your barn with self and not with God." We'll pause there and dive into this parable. There's a lot that Jesus is getting at, but let's start out first by clarifying what he is and isn't talking about. So is Jesus' issue with this farmer, is the issue in this parable that this guy has done well? Is that the issue? No. Is the issue that he's had barns that he's been storing his harvest in the past? Is that an issue? No. Okay, is the issue that this is a year of abundance. Is that a problem that this is a year of abundance? For God, is it a problem? No. I think the problem is around how he's responding to this abundance. So this man has had this incredible harvest. And so he asks the question that we all would ask, what should I do with all of this? And he recognizes that he doesn't have enough space to store all of it. And so he needs to come up with a solution. So first of all, who does he consult as he thinks about his solution to this? Who does he consult? Himself. As far as we know, he consults no one besides himself. Now, I have to tell you, I think I'm a pretty smart guy. You may or may not agree. But if I only consult myself, well, I'm going to make some mistakes, no doubt about it. And the problem with consulting myself is I tend to think about myself first. Not all the time, but honestly, more than I'd like to admit. And this man, faced with this problem, he doesn't have a conversation with God about it. He just says, hey, you know, what do I need to do? And then a bright idea occurs, the perfect solution to this situation. I'm going to keep it all for myself. And then the result being, what does he get to do if he keeps it all for himself? Retire early. He's going to have it made. Thank you, God, for giving me all I need to retire early and have it made, right? Well, I mean, that seems kind of smart. Seems kind of wise. Okay, so let's flip it around a little bit and say, so what's God have to say about all of this? What bigger picture? Let's first of all notice that the response here at the end of that is really interesting. It says, God showed up and said, fool, tonight you die, and your barn full of goods, who gets it? And I think maybe that's, first of all, a place we always need to have, which is where we started worship today, which was saying, tomorrow's not guaranteed to any of us. It's not. And we need to live every day knowing that. It's not to be scared about the future. It's to acknowledge that this life is limited and nothing is promised. It's not. We live into today. That doesn't mean so I should just go give away everything or spend everything because, but it means that we don't assume that we are owed anything. We don't assume that we're going to get anything. But you know what we can assume? We can assume that no matter what that is, God's got us. That's the starting point. The starting point is, no matter what this is going to be, I know that God has me. We have to start there. We start there, that changes everything. So we start at that point, and then we ask, so what is God's intent in this situation? And what's God's intent for us? And I think we would say that, first of all, God's intent for us is not to hoard things to ourselves, right? Or to keep too much for ourselves. Now, of course, we are to make some provision. It seems that this has been storing his harvest every year in his existing barns, and as far as we know, that's not an issue. The issue in this case is that he has more than enough, and his reaction is, good, now I can retire early and take it easy and have the life I've always wanted to have. Now, how many of us, being honest, find ourselves going down that line of thinking? Wouldn't it be great if I could get whatever, and then retire early? And the assumption with retiring early in our culture is, so I can have the life I've been wanting to have. So I can chill out, relax, do whatever I want to do. Now let's just talk about that whole thing for a moment. First of all, human history. For how many other generations do you think it's been an issue for human beings in all of human history? For how many generations do you think it's been an issue of what are we going to do in our retirement because we'll have nothing to do? How many generations of human beings has that been a problem? Probably none. I think we're at the first, right? I mean, let's be honest. We lose sight of history, don't we? We lose sight of the trajectory of history and human existence and our place in it. And we lose sight of the fact that we are way more prosperous than humans have ever been. We have so much at our disposal. And we've decided now, at least in our culture, we've decided that there should come a time in our life where we can just make it about us. Now, if you're a retired person, I'm not pointing a finger at you and saying you're being selfish. I'm not doing that. Let's recognize that throughout our lives we have different stages, and at different stages we have different focuses, or focusi, is that the right word? Focusi. And that's all part of how it is. But the question is, if I think about later in my life, am I thinking about, I can't wait till I get to that point where I can just take care of myself and relax? Or is the question, what would God have me do when I get to that stage in my life? Right? Now that's the problem here with this man. He's not asking the question, what would God have me do with this? He's asking the question, what should I do? This last month, we have seen people giving everything that they can give. You all are incredibly generous people. The way that our communities have responded in giving in lots of ways is remarkable. And I think it speaks to what Jesus is getting at here. But it's a reminder for us that even when there's not disasters, our community needs us. Our community needs the gifts we have. Our community needs our time. Our community needs our talents. Whatever those are, we are called by God to be using those for the good of the community rather than with the question, what do I want right now? Okay, you see where we're going with this? So the issue here isn't that this man has done well. It's that his logical conclusion is, now this means I can take it easy and have the time of my life. And that's alluring, isn't it? Isn't it? It's so alluring for us to think about when we get to that time where finally we can just do the thing that we do. Now, I also want to say that I think part of the reason this is so strong in our culture is because in our culture, we're also workaholics. Now, some of us have a choice in that, some of us don't. Some of us work for places that just expect it. So I want you to hear me saying, I understand why we think this way and why this happens. And maybe it's time as a culture we have some conversations about this. Why do we think it's okay that we should kill people until they get to a retirement age and then they can just go chill? Maybe we need some balance to this whole thing, right? Maybe we need some balance here. But let's go back to the horses. Bucket of apples. Man, that's awesome. I better protect it for myself. And that's where we tend to go. So let's move the conversation into the next section here. In verse 22, Jesus continues. It says, he continued this subject with his disciples. Don't fuss about what's on the table at mealtime or if the clothes in your closet are in fashion. There is far more to your inner life than the food you put in your stomach. And there's more to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Look at the ravens, free and unfettered, not tied down to a job description, carefree in the care of God. And you count far more. What's Jesus getting at? Well, he goes on, he says, what I'm trying to do here is to relax, not be so preoccupied with getting, so you can respond to God's giving. People who don't know God and the way he works fuss over these things. You know both God and how God works. Steep yourself in God reality, God initiative, God provisions. You'll find all your everyday human concerns will be met. Don't be afraid of missing out. You're my dearest friends. The Father wants to give you the very kingdom itself. Be generous. Give to the poor. It was a bank that can't go bankrupt. A bank in heaven. Far from bank robbers, safe from embezzlers. A bank you can bank on. It's obvious, isn't it? The place where your treasure is the place you will most want to be and end up being. Jesus says a whole lot in all of that, doesn't he? But what Jesus is calling our attention to ultimately, I think here, goes back to what I've been saying through this whole series. It's a question of trust. It's a question of trust. Who or what do we trust? Where do we place our trust? At the end of the day, do we trust that God's got us? That no matter what happens tomorrow, God's got us? Do we trust that? Do we trust that no matter what comes our way, we're going to be okay? Now, I have no idea what the future is going to be, and I don't know if I will have the retirement I dream of having. I don't know if I will get to see my children get married and have babies. I don't know any of those things. And if I'm really honest about it, sometimes that might be scary. But if I believe that God got me and God's got them no matter what, it changes the conversation. So do I live today in such a way that I'm trying to protect everything? Or do I live today in such a way that I'm free to live? You see, I think what Jesus is pushing us on is to consider the bigger picture of what it means to have abundant life. Okay, because we have this twisted view in our society. Jesus said, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly. And we tend to think of abundant life as that pie in the sky, great life we're looking forward to. And what Jesus was talking about was a life of being set free. That's what he's getting at. He's saying, allow yourself to be set free so that you can be what I created you to be. The question for this man with the barns, the question isn't, how is this a gift for you to keep for yourself? But rather, how is God calling you to use this as a gift? How is God calling you to open this up for God's kingdom purposes? When we start living from that perspective, that changes how we live. It changes how we budget. It changes where we put our priorities, what we do with our time. Abundant life is more about being who God created us to be than getting something. And who did God create us to be? God created us to be co-creators. That is, people who join with God and God's mission in the world. God's mission in the world for all people. And we believe that God created each of us to be a part of that bigger picture. And so the game for us isn't, do we have enough to do the thing that we want to do? But rather, how is God calling me to be a part of this bigger picture? How do I get to be part of it? What's my role in all of this? Am I willing to let go so that I can be free to be open to living the way that God is calling me to live? That's the challenge for us. But Jesus says the Father wants to give you the very kingdom itself. How do we possess the kingdom? By letting go. It's a paradox, my friends. We possess the kingdom, we live into the kingdom by letting go, by being open and free. We sang in that song, who the Son sets free is free indeed, right? I'm a child of God. That's who I am. You know, when we were singing that song, we sing songs like that to declare God's promises for us. We sing those songs to declare God's promises for us. And when we declare what we're doing when we're declaring those is we're claiming them to be true for us. We're proclaiming those promises to be true. So when Jesus talks about us living into the kingdom, he's talking about us trusting those promises so that we are set free. So friends, what do you think? You got a bucket of apples in front of you. What are you going to do with that bucket of apples? You can get sick on it or make room for others. It's much more fun to make room for others. Jane?
I've experienced, when you say paradox, the things that I value most, if I share it with somebody, whether it be finances or a favorite baking pan, suddenly it devalues it for me and it's not so much of a burden for me. When I'm able to share it, it's like, and I was fine without it.
Yeah.
So it is, but it's kind of practicing that to really understand how that feels. That it's not a feeling of scarcity once you share it. It's actually like giving love away. You don't lose that. It doesn't deplete.
No. Jane was speaking to the power of giving away, of sharing, and that somehow when those things that we value most, when we decide to share them, they become more than they were, but they also lose their value to us in terms of us needing to hold on to them. Suddenly, it's worth so much more. And love is the easiest example of that. The other thing I'll say, which I think also is part of what you were saying, Jane, is that you've heard me talk about how Anna and we tithe to the church. That means we give 10% of what God gives us. We give it back to the church. And the way I talk about that is it's important for me to do that for my own spirit. It's important for me to do it for my own spirit. Because the temptation always is, but look what else I could do with that money. 10%'s a lot. And I can think of a lot of things that I would like to do with that. I have all sorts of ideas, actually. And the temptation is to go back to that and think that it's mine to choose. And it is so good for me spiritually to continue to let go and say, that's not mine. It's not mine to choose. It's God's. I need to give it to God. It's good for me spiritually to do so. And that's one of the biggest hurdles for us to get over, because we always believe that, yeah, but I've got to put this away. And yeah, but I need it for this other thing. And I just have to start my budget out by saying, this is God's. And that I'm hands off from that. It's not my choice. I can't have it. It's God's. I need to share. And it makes a big difference. So, friends, we're challenged. Jesus always challenges us. And again, hear this from what I started with today. The horses are a great example. It's our human nature. It's our human nature. Scarcity is a real thing, and we want to keep and protect and control. And God says, let go. Let go and trust that I've got you. Let's pray. Awesome, God. You challenge us. You always challenge us. And today we are challenged to consider our trust in you and our tendency to not really trust you fully, because life is scary and hard, and we want to make sure we always have enough. Help us to trust that you provide enough, that you will always give us enough, that no matter what comes tomorrow or the day after that, that you've got us. You've got our loved ones. You've got us all. And more than that, Lord, help us to find our place in your bigger picture, to see how you're calling us to be a part of the abundance for everyone, to be those who give, who share, who lift up. Help us to experience the joy of your kingdom as we let go and trust you more fully. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Friends, I just invite you to a minute of prayer. Talk to God. What's stirring in your heart today around all of this?